Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first episode of the Taking His Hand podcast presented by truthbooks.com. I'm Lance Taylor, and I'll be your host. Today, we're going to be joined by the Vice President and Editor of Truth Magazine, Mark Mayberry. Welcome, Mark.
Hey, Lance. I appreciate being invited to be a part of this, and I'm excited at this inauguration.
Yeah, good to have you on here with us. I want to give all of our listeners just a little bit of information about why we're doing this podcast. We are presenting this to serve as a resource to connect, learn, and grow by hearing discussions about materials, books, products, resources, and topics of interest to Christians. We'll talk with authors, educators, suppliers, developers, and more about the latest news and notes for you from a biblical view. And as an organization, Truth Publications' purpose is to publish and provide trustworthy Bible-based books and resources to help you and your church grow closer to God. And this will just be another way in which we can use an avenue and a medium to reach more people. Today, we are going to talk about teaching our children in a pandemic year. This has certainly been an unusual time in 2020 or 2020. And it has put enormous challenges on the church and individual Christians. Mark, in your work in Texas, I know you can speak to this quite a bit, but we want to kind of delve into this idea specifically of teaching our children and what could be lost in this generation because of what we faced this year.
Exactly. It has been probably the most challenging year for teaching that I can recall. And in some ways, it puts us at a disadvantage of trying to accomplish our goals. But, we depend on our assemblies for much of our spiritual instruction. Now, we also, of course, study at home with our family in private, but there is something extremely important about the assembly of the saints. And so when we're prohibited from assembling, it affects us. And that happens on an ongoing basis as we deal with work's demands sometimes and sickness and travel, but the need to regularly attend and assemble, the Bible emphasizes the value of that, and we've been challenged, during this COVID crisis in particular. The government has placed restrictions upon us, and thankfully those are being lifted in many places, but still that has impacted our ability to hold classes at the same level and at the same way that we used to. And I think that's affecting us.
Absolutely. And especially when thinking about the younger generations and our children, it may be something that as more mature Christians we could take for granted, that we have this knowledge base of the Bible and we have this knowledge of the lessons that we need to learn from God's Word. But, if you go several weeks on end without having children in Bible school classes and Wednesday night studies and things like that, we can really lose some ground there.
Exactly. And, brethren have tried to do their best, and I don't want to be hard or harsh in looking at the efforts of our brethren if they've tried to deal with this crisis, but we also, we can face the real danger of sliding backwards and losing ground. And so, yes, we can accomplish a lot through distance learning, through our virtual Bible studies, but it does require discipline. It does require oversight. It does require routine and a structure. And if those are not in place, our children are not going to thrive and not going to learn as we would like. And, I'm reminded of this phrase, virtual Bible study. I use it to describe part of what we do here in Alvin, and it's appropriate. But, when you look at the definition of virtual, and Oxford English Dictionary defines it, it's an adjective describing something. It says something that is nearly as described, but not completely so, not according to the strict definition. And so, yes, it gets us close, and yes, it's a good fallback, but it should never be viewed as sort of the default position from which we're going to operate going forward. We'll lose too much ground if we do.
Absolutely. So in thinking about those terms, you bring up virtual and just the reality that we've had to face in 2020. But maybe what specific challenges has the local church faced? Not only to go virtual, but how do you make that happen, and what does that look like in a local congregation?
Right. Well, we want to get as close as we can to the benefits that come from our regular face-to-face assembly. And we need the things that come from that direct interaction that really cannot be fully achieved virtually. So we need discipline, we need oversight, we need structure. Those things can be put in place in a virtual class setting, but it's harder, and it's I really don't believe it's quite as effective. And so, if we're going to use the virtual approach, parents in particular have the responsibility of making sure that their children are participating and preparing. I think with even greater need for intensity than in normal circumstances, because we're already at a disadvantage, and so we need to sort of double down to make sure that we're not losing ground.
Yeah, and you bring up parents. I think that's been something that maybe a lot of parents this year have been kind of scrambling and struggling to figure out, well, what do we do? When assemblies at the church are not happening as normal, then what do we do? How do we do it around the kitchen table? How do we do it in our living rooms? How do we incorporate it into the children's daily routine, which has been in upheaval too, with maybe virtual schooling instead of actually going to the classroom in many cases. So, when you think about the importance of what we're encouraged to do in Ephesians 6:4 to bring up our children in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, that's directed to parents. But this has been a challenging year with new challenges.
It has, and I think as I look at the congregation of which I'm a member, the Adu Street congregation here in Alvin, as I think about my own life, I'm the product of public education. I guess I'm assuming you are as well, Lance. But
Actually, I went to a private
many of
school.
us have, many of us have chosen to homeschool or send our kids to private school, and so for homeschoolers, they're already in the mode of learning in a home environment. So I think for those families, the adjustment, it's been an adjustment, but it hasn't been quite as dramatic as, say, for the public schoolers, that are all of a sudden their lives have been turned upside down. So it's been an adjustment for everyone, but it's caused added stress level, it's caused added time demands, and sometimes mom and dad are working at home and the kids are trying to do their school and trying to do their Bible study, and it's just overwhelming. And so, we have time, we have stress, we have the inability to focus on all that we really think needs to occur, and so the exhaustion level can kick in. But what we've done here at Alvin that I think has been effective and at least has benefited the brethren here is we've tried to mix together a combination of virtual and also face to face. We went for a few weeks there where it was all together virtual and realized we've got to step this up. This just was, once we had the opportunity of being able to assemble, even with, as we call it, social distancing, we made it possible for us to have in-service activity for the children. What we did is we took Wednesday night and we divided it in half. And so half of it was done and is done, still doing it, in a VBS question and answer kind of engagement with the young people. And so one of the men leads songs and leads in questions and interacts with the kids for about half the assembly time. And then I spend the rest of the time leading in our ongoing study of the life of Christ. Now that complements the virtual Bible studies that are occurring, either done via Zoom, or some other, means of communication. Our parents are actively involved in teaching their children, and I can see that when the man stands up on Wednesday and asks questions, the answers are forthcoming. The kids
Yeah.
know the answers, and so it's working. It's working, but it's going to take involvement, and I really think of blending together as if we can work out some arrangement where we still have that face-to-face contact between teacher and student. That's so valuable. I was talking to one of our teachers here in the congregation, a public school teacher, very gifted, very dedicated. She's a wonderful lady. And she says the thing she misses the most in the virtual study environment that she's having to deal with some of her students even this fall semester is the lack of interaction and the lack of contact with her students and the lack of making that emotional connection. And so to the degree that we can accomplish that with our brethren, Paul was, Timothy and Paul shared a close relationship, and I think that that's often There are people that stand out in our lives, and often it's our Bible class teachers that make a big impact in our lives.
That's very true, and I wonder too with what you mentioned about Wednesday night and the children. I think that really piques my interest. I'm assuming that you're having to make some effort to maybe spread out the kids or have them sit with parents even while that's going on, because that's been well, what do you do in a situation like that?
Yeah, and so we decided, that we can't trust our kids to maintain social distancing. They're just not going to do it, And so we're trying to abide by the directions of our governor, and he's been very accommodating to the needs of religious people, and we haven't faced the hostility that some brethren have in certain states and in other regions. So I'm thankful for that. But, we just knew the normal class setting is not going to work. And so what we do in our congregation is that we have on the Wednesday night VBS style study. The kids are sitting with their parents, and so they're sitting in the same assigned seat they do on Sunday morning and on Sunday night. So we're keeping that distance, but we tried to shift them close enough to the front to where they're sort of up there engaging more directly with the teacher because they're closer, and there's that proximity. We make it work. It's not as ideal as what we would like, but you do what you need to do to make it work.
Absolutely. I mean, for a local congregation, the eldership, the deacons, the minister that serves in those places, it's about feeding the flock. And what I'm hearing is you, along with so many others, have come up with ways in the local congregation to be creative, but still accomplish what ultimately needs to be done.
Matt Bassford wrote a great article a few months ago for Truth Magazine when we addressed the issue of the COVID crisis. And one thing he said was that the diversity with which brethren have faced this issue and the answers and the solutions they've come up with to their individual situation is the strength of the church. Now, there is a pattern we follow, that, there is a standard that we must abide by. But how we go about implementing that on a local basis, we have judgment, we have discernment, we have individual needs. And so, I admire the fact that, brethren have been creative in trying to solve this problem.
Yeah,
and that's what we're here to help.
Absolutely. And it speaks to the wisdom of God and the autonomy of the local churches to be able to make the decisions in their local areas, to be able to kind of move with whatever has to be done in that community for that specific group of people. I think that's something that's been really neat to see. You mentioned Truth Magazine, so I'm going to shift just a second to one, reintroduce you. For those who are listening to us, you're listening to the first episode of the Taking His Hand podcast presented by truthbooks.com. Our guest today is the Vice President and Editor of Truth Magazine, Mark Mayberry. And Mark does an excellent job with our magazine. It's a monthly publication. Many of you may not realize as you're listening to this that we put out a monthly magazine available in digital format and print format. And it's focused on teaching Bible principles, accepting the Bible as the inspired Word of God, covering moral and doctrinal topics, making practical applications. There are a number of continual authors that are involved in that, as well as new ones coming on at different times. It's just an excellent read if you're interested in that. You can learn more at truthmagazine.com or subscribe today at truthbooks.com. So really appreciate Mark being with us today. I want to ask another question that I think we've established how this is important, but some people may say, does this really matter right now? It is a pandemic. It is a health crisis. We're in an election year when there's turmoil and all kinds of things going on. I think it's very easy to get caught up in the extent of the virus, the social injustice, the coming election, and kind of almost feel like we can just go into a shell and just survive for right now. So I guess the concerning question from my side that I want to present to you is, could this really have long-term consequences to try to get our attention right now to say, maybe we haven't done so good thus far in 2020, but we need to take it serious and really pick up right now as parents and as leaders in the Lord's church to do what we can at this point.
Right. The devil is constantly trying to get us to take our eyes off of Jesus. And we're in the midst of a cultural storm and a health pandemic. And if you think of the example from the Bible of Jesus walking on the water, in the midst of the storm, that can be a metaphor for, in some ways, what we're facing.
Absolutely.
Peter, he said, "Lord, if it be thou, bid me to come out of the boat." And, Jesus said, "Come." Peter stepped out and began to walk on the water, which was an amazing miracle. Jesus showing his power over the normal forces of nature. Peter was fine until he took his eyes off Jesus. And so what we need to do is make sure that we don't take our eyes off the goal, which is heaven and helping each other get there, of remembering that God is in control, even in the midst of a pandemic and in the midst of a society that seems to be unraveling at the seams. It's not unraveling because of Christianity. It's unraveling because of a lack of application of Christianity. And so, yes, there is turmoil all around us. And I would counsel and advise brethren and friends and listeners to not get so wrapped up in the constant 24/7 news cycle that is before us, if we're not careful all the time, that keeps us from focusing and deeply focusing on the things that really matter. I cannot personally change the culture, at least to any large measure, but I can change myself, and I can impact my family, and I can help my brethren, and theoretically, hopefully, lead others to Christ. So we need to focus on what we can do, and not get so consumed with the turmoil in which we live that we let our time be frittered away and our attention be robbed. So, I think the gospel does change the world. Yes, there's injustice. Yes, there's uncertainty. But the solution's in the Word of God that changes the hearts of men one individual at a time. And that's really what we need to be focusing on.
Very true. And, maybe from an individual standpoint, we've talked about how we need to teach our children in this pandemic why it really matters. But, even as an individual, we've got to make sure that we're staying connected, keeping our eyes on Jesus, as you mentioned. So maybe from your experience and from what you're seeing others do and what you yourself are doing, how can we encourage others to maybe better grow their own knowledge on their own? Understanding that, services at the building may be disrupted, as far as the assemblies and such. But what are some recommendations you might make in that regard?
I think that we need to grow in two distinct areas. We need to strive for emotional stability, and that we also need to strive intellectually to grasp more of God's will and more of God's world. So, I believe we have material that helps us in that regard, as that we offer through Truth Publications. We have excellent devotional material that can help us keep our hearts and our minds right and meditate as we ought. That's a word that sometimes I shy away from because of the misconceptions associated with it, but it is a very biblical idea. And there's a psalm, Psalm 77, in which one of the sons of Asaph wrote this. He says, "I shall remember the deeds of the Lord. I shall surely remember your works of old. I will meditate on all your work and muse on your deeds, because your way, O God, is holy, and what God is great like our God." And so, we need that emotional, spiritual, meditative experience in times of crisis, probably more so than normal. And one of the books that we offer that has been beneficial to many is Greg Littmer's book, That You May Grow Thereby. It is a daily devotional, so that's something that we have available, in our collection of products that I highly recommend. And then on the level of intellectual growth, of spiritual knowledge, we are to grow deeper in our understanding. One of the things our teenagers studied in the early stages of the COVID crisis was Joshua Gertler's workbook on evolution and creation. Now, that's a hard enough book in the first place, dealing with a challenging subject.
Right.
We did this virtually. Now, it worked because we had dedicated kids and we had very highly competent and qualified teachers, and they were able to work through the challenges that distance learning involved. But that's an excellent way of grounding our faith. Another book that I think is very useful that has been published in the last couple of years by Truth Publications is Dan King's new commentary on the book of Revelation, I Saw the Heavens Open. And when I was in the Philippines a couple of years ago, we taught the early manuscript of this, and it's excellent material. It's very presentable, very accessible, but it takes a difficult book, Revelation, and it makes it accessible and understandable to those who want to use the Bible as their foundation.
So ultimately what we're trying to help people understand is that resources are out there. Nothing takes the place of Scripture, but all of these things can be great resources to help guide and provoke thought and make you get in the Scriptures to study those things even deeper. And that's just another way that you can look. You can find all those books that Mark mentioned online at truthbooks.com. We'd be glad to help you inside CEI Bookstore with any of those things as well. Mark, I really appreciate what you've brought to the table for us today. This has been enlightening. It's been helpful. It's been encouraging, and that's what we really want to do. And I just want to say thank you for taking your time and joining us. I know you've got a lot going on with your local work there in Texas, but also with your work for our organization with Truth Magazine and more. And just really appreciate you being a part of it today.
Thank you, Lance. And it's Truth Publications, which is a wonderful group of people. And we are dedicated, to the simple statement, taking God's hand, helping each other home, which is the title of this podcast, to try to remind us every time we hear this message like this, that's really what it's all about. That's what our purpose is. Thank you, Lance.
Absolutely, absolutely. We value your feedback as listeners, too. If there are guests or topics or improvements that you would like to suggest to our team, you can contact us at podcast@truthbooks.com. And thank you once again. May God bless every one of us as we try to do exactly what Mark was talking about, taking his hand and helping each other to that heavenly home. Next time, we're going to be joined by Kyle Pope, another member of our Truth Publications team, and we're going to talk about the topic of voting as a Christian. We are in an election year. This is something that tugs on the heartstrings of all of us as individuals, but especially as Christians, and we look forward to having Kyle on to talk with us about that topic and share some insights toward that end. Until next time, we'll see you on Taking His Hand, Helping Each Other Home, the podcast.